you very much for your introduction and good evening to everyone. Prince Jovan Vladimir of Dioclea in present-day Montenegro, who lived at the beginning of the 11th century in a bordering polity between the Byzantine and Latin cultural spheres, is regarded as the earliest known Slavic saint from the Western Balkans. Hagiographical narrative on his martyrdom should be placed within the context of ruler martyrs murdered out of political self-interest by Christians themselves. This phenomenon was common in the newly Christianized lands on the northern and eastern periphery of Europe between the 10th and 12th century. Regardless of the rising cultural differences between the Western and Eastern Christianity, these saints, such as Boris and Gleb of Rus, or Magnus Erlendsson of the Orkney Islands, or Jovan Vladimir of Dioclea, did not resort to revenge or fratricide as a means of struggle for power, but voluntarily persevered in high Christian moral ideals stemming from the imperative of love towards God and one's neighbor by accepting their death for the benefit of peace in their homelands. The most elaborated source on Jovan Vladimir's martyrdom is the hagiographical interpolation within the Latin historiographical text Gesta Regum Sclavorum, or more commonly known as the Chronicle of the Priest of Dioclea. This chronicle is regarded as the earliest medieval narrative source from the Western Balkans, probably redacted in the second half of the 12th century. Ruler martyrdom and the motif of the Good Shepard. During the military conflicts between the Byzantine Emperor Basil II and the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel, Jovan Vladimir was a loyal vassal of Byzantium. When Samuel attacked the territory of Dioclea, Jovan Vladimir was betrayed by one of his officials and sent into captivity to Samuel's capital city of Prespa in Macedonia. He was liberated owing to the pleas of Samuel's daughter, Kosara, who fell in love with him, and Samuel granted Kosara's wish, made Jovan Vladimir his son-in-law, and sent him back to Dioclea as a new Bulgarian vassal prince. After the death of Samuel in 1014, his nephew, Ivan Vladislav, usurped the throne by killing his cousin, Gavril Radomir, Samuel's son and rightful successor. The new Tsar called Jovan Vladimir to Prespa, and when Jovan Vladimir arrived and was praying in one of the city's churches, Ivan Vladislav sent his assassins to the church to kill the innocent prince. The Prince of Dioclea then took confession and Holy Communion and went out. As soon as he stepped outside the church, he was assassinated. Not long after this event, Ivan Vladislav was himself treacherously assassinated by one of his soldiers as a result of a Byzantine plot. The chronicle provides a biography of a ruler martyr combining biblical reminiscences with the circumstances of Jovan Vladimir's life. Therefore, his life and death are fundamentally understood not in terms of a political struggle, but in terms of perseverance in love until the end, resulting in the willing self-sacrifice for the benefit of others. This notion is centered around the motif of the Good Shepard from the Gospel of John, serving as an example of a virtuous ruler who, through following Christ, lays down his life for his people. The murdered prince of Dioclea uses his position as a leader for the canonic imitation of Christ. Prespa eventually becomes Jovan Vladimir's Calvary, a place of his innocent death comparable to the place of Christ's crucifixion. The entire story about Jovan Vladimir can be understood in terms of the Eucharistic image of the Good Shepherd, whose blood is poured out for many. Ruler martyrdom in medieval Europe. In the Byzantine Empire of the time, this phenomenon was unknown. Such saints also cannot be found in the South European Latin hagiographies. Ruler martyrs from peripheral lands formed a new tradition. Their role was to legitimize the existence of their newly Christianized peoples and to position them within a general Christian narrative. Jovan Vladimir's martyrdom can be compared to the life and death of Princes Boris and Gleb from the Rurik dynasty of Rus. They were murdered by their half-brother Sviatopolk in 1015. The martyrdom of Boris and Gleb is seen as a historically and geographically specific re-realization of the Old Testament story of Abel, embodied in the innocent brothers Boris and Gleb, and Cain, on the other hand, embodied in the murderous brother Sviatopolk. Hence, emphasizing the fact of the principle of love towards one's enemies made it into the acts of the representatives of the East Slavic secular authorities, the bearers of the political ideal in the Christian society, which eventually served the confirmation of the legitimacy of the Rurik dynasty. In the context of ruler martyrs, similar to the case of Jovan Vladimir and Boris and Gleb, the death of Magnus Erlendsson, the Earl or Jarl of the Orkney Islands within the Norwegian kingdom, is worth special mention. Jarl Magnus of Orkney was assassinated between 1115 and 17 at the behest of his cousin Hakon, who had rival claims to rule the Orkney Isles. Magnus decided against violent resistance to spare the lives of his men. The internal political plot led by a close relative, the Earl's non-resistance on principle, the last hour praying and attendance at Mass, all this recalls vividly the manner of the deaths of the Slavic martyred princes, such as Boris and Gleb and Jovan Vladimir. Magnus's willingness to suffer martyrdom heralds the spread of the religion even to a remote land like the Orkneys. Magnus, however, does not convert his people to Christianity, for they are already Christians in name. But his innocent blood, Magnus's blood, has washed away the violent pagan past, heralding a new era of the Orkney Isles. The category of murdered rulers or other members of the ruling dynasty as saints was thus typical of those parts of medieval Europe where the new Christian ideals had only started to gradually shape the social norms. Ruler martyrs were regarded by their contemporaries as promoters of the new ideal of the Christian monarch and symbols of the rejection of the recent pagan past. Their deaths are presented within a framework of confrontation between exemplary and false Christians opposing them. The writers of medieval European peripheries elevate a type of sacrifice defined by following the example of Christ, the canonic example of Christ, and breaking the cycle of violence which results in the victim gaining entry into the kingdom of heaven. And now, conclusion. The martyrdom of Jovan Vladimir and the phenomenon of medieval ruler martyrs can be additionally contextualized using the theory of mimetic violence by René Girard. In this respect, an irreconcilable duality emerges between the archaic mythical world and the gospel. Violent sacrifice of someone's life for the alleged benefit of the community and voluntary sacrifice out of love for every irreplaceable human life. The main difference between mimetic violence and the Christian worldview lies in their relation to the other, the ambivalence. The ambivalent archaic culture finds the other both attractive, worthy of imitation, and dangerous, adequate for sacrifice, while the Christian mindset presupposes love towards every person and acknowledges the innocence of the victim. The phenomenon of ruler martyrs can be explained in two fundamental ways. It enabled newly Christianized ruling dynasties to position themselves in the Christian Salvation history, and it also positioned their polities in the symbolic center of the European culture of the time. Its centrality was ensured through hagiographical narratives of saints, and this also explains why the first written records produced in the eastern and northern periphery of medieval Europe are all about local saints. Therefore, not only did the earlier periphery become the center, but the division between the center and periphery lost its relevance. Wherever God's presence was manifested through a saintly ruler, his people were in the center of the Christian world. Decision of the ruler martyrs to persevere in love until the end was a manifestation of the creation of a new Christian community. Thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to be a part of this conference.